All right, good morning, everyone. I'm going to teach you a word today, and that's something that I hope as non-Indigenous people in this room who may work with Indigenous children and families is honoring and respecting their culture, their heritage, their language when you're working with them. But first, I'd like to thank Deborah and ACT for the invitation to come and have a dialogue with you all today. And of course, thanking Shane, our knowledge keeper from Musqueam, coming up and opening us in a good way today and reminding us that we're here to do good work and do better. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional terror of the Coast Salish Musqueam people where we're working today. I said it already, Diana Elliott, but my Coast Salish Hulkameetnam Cowichan tribe's name is Thaqualot, and I carry that name from my dad's side of the family, from the Quamachin village. There's 7 villages in Cowichan, and I'm from the Quamachin village. I'm also Nucholnath from the Hoopachesset First Nation in Port Alberni, where my mother is from, and my Nucholnath name is Noskuasaks, and I received that name when I was 20. I carry my grandmother's name. So just to start off, just to let you know who I am, and the word I'm going to teach you today is Aitnatah. I'd like to hear you all say Aitnatah. Good. I heard some good. That means good morning in my language. Is it the same in Musqueam? Aitnatah?
Squale.
Squale. We say squale for good day, and in Cowichan, and Aitnatah for good morning. So you know 2 new words today. So to talk a little bit about our research, I just want to know how many of you, if you don't mind, how many, just by show of hands, are either First Nations or Métis? Awesome. And how many of you have children maybe with autism on your caseloads? Okay, a little fewer. And there are parents of children with autism? Okay, so I just want to acknowledge you as the true experts here in the room today who us as professionals have to learn from as we help you support your children grow up to be the best they can be. So of the non-Indigenous people in the room, how many of you work with Indigenous children and families? Okay. A little fewer, but that's okay, and that's why we're all here today, to learn from each other. So what we thought we'd start with today is, this is related to research with children with autism, and I'm not going to specifically speak about that, but it's all related. Aboriginal Infant Development Programs have been around for a long time. We actually had a program from 1980 to 1983 in Cowichan tribes in Duncan, and at that time it was called the Native Infant Program, or NIP. And we lost funding, and we didn't actually come back until the tripartite health transfer agreements between the federal provincial government and the First Nations communities. And since 1992, we've been back. So we've been around for 28 years as a home visiting program for Aboriginal children and families. But I have to say that you would think we had a lot of research and evaluation behind us, but we don't. We didn't actually do our first research project till 2015. So that's a lot of time that we don't have that has been documented about our programs and services and if we're doing a good job or not. Because in many, many First Nations communities, research is a 4-letter word for many, many reasons. And we don't need to talk about all those today. They may come up throughout the day in our presentations, but it hasn't always been something that we've wanted to do. It's always been something that's been done to us or at us and not necessarily with us. But we, as a program that has been supporting Aboriginal children and families for many, many years, felt we needed something to back us up. And one of my colleagues said a number of years ago, we know we're doing good work, and the families we working with know we're doing good work, but nobody else does. And we could be in jeopardy if they ever decide to cut funding. We could be in jeopardy if they decide we're not skilled or qualified enough or making a difference. So that kind of ate at me for a long time. And we've collected data on how many children on our caseloads, how many home visits we've done, but it really didn't tell us much about our program and what we actually did do and if we were making a difference. I've known Alison for a long time. We were trying to figure out when we first met or how we first met. And we've come up with around 2005. I think I was introduced to her by a mutual colleague. So we've talked on and off, and she's been very supportive of AIDP programs. And in one of our discussions one day, she mentioned she was going back to school for her PhD. And I kind of have no funds for research. I have nothing that available in my current operating budget. And one of the things that happened was in talking to Alison, maybe using us as a project for her and her schooling, which was kind of a win-win for AIDP mostly, because we got a research project and it was free. And that was the stepping stone for us to continue on working. So AIDP really we probably should be called Infant and Family Development Programs, because it really is more about family development. Again, we could talk about all of the things related to residential schools and the 60 scoop and everything else to kind of discuss how our parents have lost our parenting and nurturing over time. But we're not here to talk about that today. But we are here to say that we really are here to support parents to be the best they can be. And sometimes that's supporting children with extra support needs, and sometimes that's autism. So I just want to just a brief overview before Alison takes over is we are going to be celebrating 28 years in January of Aboriginal Infant Development Programs. It started on Vancouver Island with 2, Cowichan Tribes and Nutsamaht Tribal Council. Jackie Watts is here today. She's the Provincial Advisor for Aboriginal Supported Child Development. So they've developed and taken the AIDP program very far, and they also have a strong ASCD and early years program. So when we say 28 years old, we're really only talking about 2 programs, but we are 28 years old and we've grown to 53. We've got 53 AIDP now in BC, on and off reserve. A number of them are in friendship centers, and some of them are in health centers. Some of them are even in the Child and Family Services departments. You see me wrinkle my nose when I said that because we're connected to child welfare and just in location. So that's a little bit about us. Some of you may remember last year the Success by 6 and Children First funding was ended, and some of that funding was redirected to AIDP. So we have 5 new AIDP programs this year from the redirected funds. And so we were at 48 programs for a long time, and now we've got 5 new ones. So we're home visiting. Home visiting means we do our programs and services one-on-one with families. It doesn't necessarily mean in the home. It could be in our office. It could be in the playroom. It could be at the park. It could be at the playground at McDonald's. It could be wherever the family wants it to be. But basically, it's a home-based, home visiting program. So wherever that needs to be.
So I'd like to start by just honouring the knowledge that's in this room this morning, and how humbling it is to be welcomed by Shane Pointe on Musqueam territory. But also really to acknowledge that one of the things I've come to know over the years is that who you are is inseparable from what you know. And so we all come into this room with an enormous amount of knowledge from different places and different spaces and different life experiences and different schoolings. But we all bring enormous knowledge. The fact that Diana and I have sat at this table is very humbling and doesn't mean that our knowledge is in any way superior or we're in an expert position. I would like just to start a little bit about who I am so that you kind of get a sense of how I come to occupy the position that I do. I have a 25-year history of being an occupational therapist. I'm not registered as one anymore, but that was my background of working with very diverse families and children, mainly in communities. And in 1998, I was invited by the Lillooet Nation to visit their community, to meet their leadership, to meet their elders, and to talk with them about providing occupational therapy for the first time ever with their community members. And so that was in 98. That relationship continued until 2015. And in a nutshell, what I learned from those relationships and experiences is that I was coming from a place of not knowing. And I don't know whether you've ever been in a situation where you don't know. What do you do when you don't know? And so when I came to work with the Lillooet Nation, I had been an OT for around 12 years at least, and I thought I kind of knew what I was doing. But what I wasn't aware of at that time, and it was totally unconscious, was that I was coming with a very biomedical child development lens that I wasn't aware of. And that lens informed the things that I did. It informed the things that I focused on. It informed my practices. It informed a kind of a professional agenda that I didn't even know I had. In 2000, I decided that I needed to try and figure out what was going on. Like Shane mentioned about asking questions. I had questions and I had no answers. And when I looked to the literature in my profession, I didn't see the answers there either. The answers were coming from the community and from my conversations. And so I did a very small study for my master's in 2000, which involved interviewing families in the community that were raising children that had different disabilities, developmental disabilities, sometimes quite serious disabilities. And so the people that I was interviewing were also my clients as an occupational therapist. And I had known them for several years. And then I met with them in a space in which I now had this hat on as a very novice qualitative researcher. And I asked questions, and I knew that if I was going to be a good qualitative researcher, I had to ask broad, open-ended questions, right? That's what you do. So that's what I did. So I said, I remember starting off the interview by saying, could you just tell me your family story? I had never asked that question as an occupational therapist. And I learned things that I had never learned as an occupational therapist, because I'd come with my occupational therapist lens and way of being and way of thinking and way of asking questions. Through those conversations, I really came to more fully start to think about something that I think about continually and that I will need to continually think about. And that is the power and privilege that I represent and that I bring into my relationships with Indigenous families and colleagues that I continue to work with today. And that whether I like it or not, the broader relationships between the Canadian state and Indigenous peoples comes into the room with me and plays out in my relationships and with my interactions. One of the mums that I interviewed for that study taught me that through our conversation. And what she said to me was, do you remember the day that you did a home visit? And I didn't do many home visits. We tended to see children in the community in safe spaces for families that they chose. And they chose to meet me in the daycare, in the healthcare center, in the school. And sometimes, rarely in their homes, but sometimes. And so I said, yeah, for me, a home, but I had done loads of home visits over the course of my career at this point. So I'm like, yeah, I remember the home visit. For me, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. And she said, you know, that day that you came to my home, I was afraid that you were going to judge my home as not being up to your Canadian standards and you would take my children away. And that had not crossed my mind at all. And that lesson from that mum has stayed with me and needs to stay with me as I walk this path with Indigenous colleagues like Diana, now in doing my research, that I know that I have this power that I represent, that I need to always be trying to think about how do I reduce that power now in the ways that I do research. One of the And so that experience led me into really thinking that the ways of thinking and doing in terms of occupational therapy, but also physiotherapy and speech language pathology at that time, back in the early 2000s, there wasn't anything there. There was nobody exploring or advocating or doing anything. And so I started looking more broadly outside of those knowledges and started looking at other knowledges to try and figure out, well, what do we need? And when I went back into academia and looked at book knowledge, for me, it was always a circular process of reading something, but then always thinking back. When you spent a long time as a practitioner, I don't know whether you find this if you've gone on to do any further education, but you always come back to those experiences in community and think, and my big question that guides my research and that I tell my students now, the big question is, so what? So when I read something, or I hear some research, I'm always thinking, so what? What are the benefits? It has to have benefits. There have to be practical implications. I'm not interested in generating research just for the sake of the intellectual exercise. I'm a practitioner by heart. It has to have practical benefits for communities, for children, for programs. And so that led me into doing my doctoral research. And when I was doing this doctoral research, Diana and I had a conversation about working together. Should I talk about that a little bit? So one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to think outside the box. I wanted to think differently about early intervention therapy. And I wanted to bring a different way of thinking about it. And at that time, I was very much influenced by by a mentor of mine, Dr. Annette Brown, who's a professor in the School of Nursing at UBC, who was my supervisor at the time and is still a mentor for me. And she was doing a lot of work around equity and around this idea of health equity. And I was really curious about the work she was doing. It was all with adults. It was with Indigenous and non-Indigenous adults who experienced marginalization. And her work was really around supporting primary health care. And how that needed to change and look different. And through that kind of experience of learning from her, I started, and I also knew then about AIDP. And through our conversations, I kind of knew that AIDP were doing things a little bit differently. And they had been really successful at engaging with communities and engaging with families, and in doing things that maybe were outside the box and that maybe we could learn from. And so that was my motive. And I remember distinctly sending an email to Diana, and I'm like, okay, so I'm in my doctoral coursework, I'm doing this program, I don't have a research program, and I'm like, I think it would be great to do something with AIDP. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to send Diana an email. And I remember sending that email and thinking, if she says no, I'm screwed. I don't know what, I haven't got plan B. And so I'm like, okay, Diana, what do you think? Do you think we could do some research together? And like it was a quick response. She goes, big caps, yes, let's do it. So that was a big relief. Didn't have any plans, no idea what we were going to do. But then we started having conversations about what we could do. And we'll talk a little bit about what we found. Do you want to say something else?
Just to add to that, it was an opportunity because like I said, I was already starting to think about research and our programs weren't buying into the research, and we were wanting to do something. Going back to my colleagues saying, we know we do good work, and our families know we do good work. So I kept thinking, we're invisible. And if you've heard me speak before, you've heard me say, and I never mean anything, I'm not being mean or anything, but I always felt like early intervention prevention programs, like AIDP, were the ugly stepsister to child welfare and child care, because that's where a lot of the focus is. But we work with families from early intervention and prevention and health promotion and working with children who have extra support needs. And we just never had a light shine on us. Not that we're there for that, but it's being visible. So that was when this was presented to me, I went, yes, finding an opportunity to bring some visibility to early intervention, health promotion, intervention, before crisis happens, before children are removed because the parents can't manage to look after their child who might have extra support needs. AIDP was a lot of our children with extra support needs were removed from their home because they were isolated in an isolated community. They had no resources on hand where they needed weekly support. So children were being moved, for instance, from the North Island down to Victoria. And so now you're getting your medical needs met, but now you have social isolation from your families and the family support that you might have. Somebody would be moving all the way from Dawson Creek down to Vancouver, and they will only last 2 or 3 months because they would rather have the social and family support than the intervention support. So I thought, AIDP, people don't understand us. They don't know what we do. And if they knew more about us, maybe they would engage with us before removing the children. So that's why I thought this research project would be great to bring some visibility, to bring some just some understanding about how our program could be utilized by doctors, public health nurses, specialists, EITs, and even social workers, if the reason they're moving the children is because they have to have access to more health and social services, that it can still happen through AIDP. So that was kind of my big capital yes, was about bringing that visibility to us, having them see us as, the ugly stepsister to these other areas that we work with in the early years with families.